Great. Well, hello to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm really delighted to welcome you to the first session of this Refugee Studies Centre public seminar series, convened in collaboration with the Global Refugee-Led Network, the GRN. The theme of this series is #ByRefugees, strengthening refugee-led humanitarian response during the COVID-19 pandemic. The series is going to focus on the role of refugee-led assistance and protection, particularly in the context of COVID-19. And it's going to focus in particular on the role of refugee-led organizations that have long played a very important role in providing essential services at a community level, but now, in the context of the current crisis, are receiving increasing recognition because they've been thrust into the front line of response in urban areas and camp settings around the world. We're going to convene over the next few weeks 5 different seminars around different aspects of this theme. All of the seminars will bring together panels of individuals and organizations whose work is shaping and indeed transforming how we understand and support refugee-led responses to the crisis. We'll cover in this session the response of the Global Refugee-Led Network, and in others, responses in urban areas, camp settings, the role of international organizations, and the role of philanthropic organizations and the private sector. Alongside those 5 seminars, we'll also have the annual Elizabeth Colson lecture delivered by Professor Laura Hammond of SOAS. And we hope that you'll join us for all of those seminars and that particular lecture. This is a theme that matters academically. It's an opportunity to think through what more participatory and inclusive models of humanitarian assistance can look like, and think critically about the way in which the world has often failed to engage adequately with questions of refugee participation. But perhaps more importantly, this is an issue that matters for practice, immediately in the present, but also for the medium and long term. Our goal in this series is to begin to work to convene a coalition of actors from across different groups, primarily refugees and refugee-led organizations, but also international organizations, NGOs, governments, academics, that can think about how we can bring recognition, funding, and greater support to the many organizations doing extraordinary work in the current response and on behalf of refugees and indeed host communities around the world. The series will aim to look at 3 broad questions. Firstly, how is it that refugees are leveraging their networks, their skills, and their resources in response to COVID-19? Secondly, how are traditional humanitarian actors, international organizations, NGOs, supporting and building on that initiative, and where are their barriers to getting greater response? And thirdly, what needs to happen to make this shift towards localization, greater refugee participation, something that can endure for the long term? What needs to change in the international system to break down those historical barriers? The first session, today's session, focuses on the theme of global agenda setting from the bottom up, the Global Refugee-Led Network. And it's a great pleasure to be joined by 4 key members of that network from different regions around the world, bringing different perspectives and all established voices on behalf of advocating for greater refugee participation. We'll let them all introduce themselves, but we're joined by Shaza al-Rihawi, a founding member of the GRN and interim chair, who's based in Germany; Mustafa, Alio, a refugee advisor and co-founder of the Jumpstart Refugee Talent, based in Canada; Najeeba Wazefadost, who's a founding member of the GRN and also active in the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, based in Australia. And Najeeba, apologies for the time. It's amazing that you're here in the middle of the night, all the way from Australia. And Anila Noor, who's a member of the GRN Steering Committee and is based in the Netherlands. They bring a wealth of experience and a variety of regional perspectives. The other thing that I really need to say at the outset is this is the first time that the RSC has convened a public event since the very sad passing of our much loved and wonderful colleague, Professor Gil Losha. For a 20-year period, Gil was a very active researcher and teacher within the Refugee Studies Centre. And he dedicated much of his life to building and pioneering refugee studies, and particularly the study of politics and international relations. And in all of his work, he connected refugee studies with policy and practice. And I think it's fitting that this series is doing something pioneering that Gil really believed strongly in. It's enabling refugees to be the predominant voice in this series. This is the first time the Refugee Studies Centre has ever been able to convene an event in which the majority of speakers are refugees. But alongside that, we miss a great scholar, colleague, and friend. And on behalf of everyone here and at the RSC, we send our condolences to Gil's family, friends, and colleagues. But I think positively, this is a series that he would really have believed in. So I'm now going to hand over to Anthony, who will say something about the housekeeping and technological side of this event. This is the first time we've done this from a technological perspective. Hopefully everything's going to run smoothly. And if it doesn't, we'll make the best of it and we'll make it work. So Anthony, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Alex. And I hope that this is the least exciting part of the entire seminar. I know that everybody's very excited for this. And so before turning to today's speakers, just a couple of notes to try to keep everybody on the same page. Firstly, to let you all know that this seminar is going to last for about an hour and a half, and we'll try to break it down 50-50 for 45 minutes of conversation, followed by 45 minutes of Q&A. Following that, we will have some closing remarks and then introduce the rest of the seminars in the series. Unfortunately, as you've seen on the Zoom webinar, we cannot allow attendees to see other attendees. So as we saw in the introductory slide, if you want to open up the chat function, if you haven't already, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the comments function. If you hit on the blue button that says, what is it? All panelists and attendees, and it will send it to all of the folks that are currently online. You can introduce yourselves, any affiliations, links, and emails that you'd like for connecting after the seminar ends. And also to note that we will be having the question and answer session, and we'll be accumulating questions throughout. So as the speakers are introducing themselves and their ideas over the next 45 minutes, please feel free to put any questions in that chat box as well. And without further ado, I think that we can introduce the four of our panelists today, who I think it's also worth mentioning will be co-moderating all subsequent sessions in this session, or in this seminar series. So thank you all very much, and let us turn first to Shaza, please. Thank
you. Hello, everyone. My name is Shaza. I am a refugee woman based in Germany. I'm a Syrian originally. I had a bachelor in psychological studies and sociology. I used to work with UNHCR as a protection officer for 8 years before I became myself a refugee here. Thank you for everyone.
Sorry, whoever would like to go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Najeeba. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I have come to Australia as a refugee. I actually had to escape Afghanistan due to a number of decades of war, and which has left basically little signs of justice and humanity. I, like many other girls and women in my country in Afghanistan, we were basically prisoners of our own sex. And we took on the dreadful journey to find security, to establish peace. And we ended up in a country named Australia. I arrived to Australia by boat, and as a result, I was detained in Australian Mandatory Detention Centre for a while. And then I was released on temporary protection visa, and I was living in limbo and uncertainty for almost a few years before I became a permanent resident in this country and being able to have access to education and my other rights, including employment and extra. I am really happy that I have been able to gain my rights as a woman, as a girl. That was my dream in my own country. I have graduated from Bachelor of Medical Science in Australia, and I've been doing my real passion and commitment is in gender advocacy. So I work in Australia in Settlement Services International as a gender advocacy, and I have basically been for the past many years. My real passion and commitment is to bring a face to refugees and to move away from the numbers and statistics. I clearly remember that when I came to Australia, my name was changed to a number. And from the time I arrived to Australian Detention Center, I carried a sign and I was called by a number rather than by my name. And I think it's really important for us to use platforms like this to share our stories and to remind people about the circumstances that pushed us to leave and escape our countries. And I'm looking forward to this series of seminar. And I thank the Refugee Research Center and Oxford University. And I also want to give my condolences to Mr. Gill's family, friends, and colleagues. And we do miss him in this space. And we're happy that Denise and Alex and Refugee Research and the Oxford University has been able to continue his passion and advocacy with us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation and thank you for attending today. My name is Mustafa Alio. I'm originally from Syria and then currently based in Canada. I come from kind of a business development background, and that's why my advocacy and role, whether here in Canada or internationally with many other refugee organizations, works around changing narratives on refugees from economic perspective. So I do a lot of work and advocacy in terms of how to economically empower refugees, but at the same time, how to change narrative to show what refugees contribute to local communities and international economies in that way. So they are agent of change and solutions, not only in aid receivers. In that way, I've worked with many initiatives. Also, I had the pleasure to work with GRN more in supporting phase or volunteering phase, just kind of on few initiatives. At the same time, I am on the executive committee with a great project here in Canada called LEARN, Local Engagement Refugee Research Networks, that works in Tanzania, Kenya, Jordan, Lebanon on the role of refugee-led organizations. And I also work with the government of Canada and a few others international players in terms of how to bring more support to refugee-led organizations and shed the lights on the important role they deliver on the ground.
Hi, my name is Anila Noor, and originally I'm from Pakistan, and now I'm based in Netherlands. So I'm really feeling privileged to be part of this whole discussion and talking about refugee participation and refugee-led initiative on this high-level discussion. Because living in Europe, we witness and we are having this discourse like this platform where refugee come as a policy advisor, refugee as a solution maker. These kind of spaces are shrinking day by day. And I'm really thankful to the Oxford Refugee Studies, like they gave this opportunity to us who are not listening to us as a data, who are not taking our our experience as an only to collect the knowledge, but also giving a face and importance of our voices in this whole debate. I still remember, and I will share it with all of you, like in 2016 in June, when we were 2016, it was Refugee Week, and I was invited to be speak on Oxford University, and I was in the camp when I came there. And it was a long journey to be part of this discussion. So today, I think it's like whole scenario change, and I'm feeling so much privileged and honored to be here in this discussion again, and with that as a partner. So we are designing this discussion, and we are also thinking how we can create more solution towards this. So thank you so much. Looking forward for this discussion.
Thank you all for those introductions. It's really wonderful to have you all here. As we've said earlier, I want to apologize to everybody for the disruptions in the side in the chat. We've got the RSC moderators that are assisting to try to keep everybody out. please feel free to populate and kick out of the comment window with some introductions to yourselves as well if you want to have those on hold. Unfortunately, we're trying to make this as accessible and participatory as possible, so we've made the webinar publicly available, but it unfortunately comes with some downsides, so we'll work to resolve that. In the meantime, we'll just stay focused on the panel, and we would like to turn to Najeeba to give an introduction to the GRN more generally. We're very curious about where the GRN has come from, what it's accomplished in the time that it's been around, and sort of what its sights are on the horizon for next steps for representation and action within the global refugee regime.
Thank you very much, Antonis. I'm sure that I'll do my best to explain around how did we come into existence as GRN, and my colleagues Anila and Shaza, they'll be very welcomed to throw comments as I'm speaking. We have come together basically as refugees, as advocates, and as activists and community organizers. And at the same time, we've tried to bring refugee women leaders into a discussion where we were realizing that policies were being made about our lives, but not necessarily with us. While our individual stories were different, the challenges we faced and the solutions we encountered were surprisingly very similar. We came from this shared experience, and we were able to speak from a very united voice. We all have united in GRN because we wanted to see a change. Wanting to see a change was basically a vision which put us together into this long journey. All across the globe, we see symptoms of a broken system. More and more people are forced to leave their homes due to conflict, persecution, and war. And I just shared my own story. You know, as a young girl, I wasn't able to receive any education back in my home country. I was having fear of my life because of the Taliban. But in addition to that, I was going through double suffering, understanding that I was a woman, I was a young girl, and I was not able to have my own rights as a human being. A lot of people around the globe are not only living because of persecution and war, but also because of climate change and environmental degradation. And the numbers of refugees or the number of forcibly displaced people have been increasing every day. The numbers are quite unprecedented, yet the political responses and needed international cooperation is very slow, and it's quite insufficient, to be honest. We do realize in GRN that without an effective response, refugees' lives are at risk every day. This inaction also feeds discrimination and other xenophobic sentiments. For many, many years, and I can go back to almost 7 to 8 years, I think it was in 2015, when after being able to share my story on national level, I started my work as a woman advocate in Australia. I started sharing my story because I found that it's very important for us to be able to share the story and the circumstances that we run away from. And as I start sharing my story on national level, I started getting invited to UNHCR in consultation in Geneva. One of my worry that I see in the national space, that the number of refugee representatives, the number of refugee women leaders in particular, were quite absent. But I wasn't too sure that this was becoming even more absent when I actually entered into the international fora. For me, it was a very constant worry in Australia that as I was sharing my story, I was only receiving sympathy. I wasn't too sure what was happening to my story, as well as the stories shared by many other refugee women and girls in the country that we were working together as a team. It was in 2015 or 2016, if I'm not wrong, myself and a few other refugee women and other refugee people, it was Shaza, we actually came together with another organization named Refugee Council of Australia. And for the first time ever in Geneva in 2015, we held a side event called Self-Representation and Refugee Participation. It was a side event which we really wanted to be a formalized agenda item within the UNHCR in consultation in Geneva. However, the time and the space didn't allow, and we actually had to hold it in the lunchtime period. It was exactly during the side event that we actually announced on this Global Refugee-Led Network initiative. And the reason that we actually announced on this is because we wanted to bring agency. We wanted to have a sense of ownership on the things and on the activities that we were running on a national and regional level. For us, meaningful refugee participation was so important. As we were speaking in international policy discussion roundtables and forums like Geneva, we realized that for many people in the room, they didn't understand what do we mean in practical terms when we actually talk about meaningful refugee participation. For many people or for many actors engaged in the forum, it was still around why should refugees be involved? Or why do we need to have refugees in the room? Or why should refugees talk about policy? It was not even about how should meaningful refugee participation happen. And we wanted to be in the room, yes, that's exactly right. But we didn't want it to be a box that has been ticked. We wanted to move away from having a tokenistic engagement of refugees, but to have much more of a meaningful refugee participation. And in order to create a space where we are engaging meaningful refugee participation, it's beyond resourcing them with funds to travel them to platforms and for them to share their stories. They need a level of preparedness. They need capacity strengthening programs. They need a lot of other programs in order to prepare and support refugees to be in spaces like humanitarian geo-consultation as one avenue of policy discussion or advocacy. The Global Refugee-Led Network basically became into coexistence after that side event when we announced the Global Refugee-Led Network. It was an ambitious idea for many stakeholders in the room in that year. For many people, it was something that's not doable. It was for us to actually talk about refugee-led. It was a new terminology. It was still a buzz, ringing a buzz in people's head. And after that side event, it almost took us 2 years till 2018, I think, for us to have continuous conversation for almost 2 years. We were able to bring refugee experts, refugee leaders, refugees from all 6 regions in the world to have continuous and regular dialogue amongst ourselves to exactly discuss what do we want from a network like Global Refugee-Led Network. And that basically led us into the first Global Summit of Refugees back in October 2018. It was a historical event because in a short time, for having a steering committee member of, I think, almost 12 people from 6 different regions, we were able to organize and put together a global summit of refugees in Geneva prior to UNHCR geo-consultation. It was a summit that was organized and led and run by refugees themselves. It was a 3-day event. We were able to talk about the issues that were basically common to each region. We were able to talk about solutions. You know, we made it very clear on that day that if anything to happen, either at local, national, regional, or international level, it has to be with and by refugees. Nothing has to happen without refugees. And soon after, that Global Summit of Refugees became the platform to actually formalize the GRN. The Global Refugee-Led Network now has 6 regional chapters in 6 regions. So that's North America, Latin America, MENA, Europe, Asia Pacific, and Europe. And in each regional chapters, we are actually working with national country focal points that are also part of the regional chapters. For us, it was very important that we were able to take some of the conversation from the international fora back to the people on the ground. It is so important around being able to share the information, the policies that we produce, the legislations that we create, to back to the people on the ground, and it's refugees. At GRN, we really believe in localized approach. We really think that if for any program or for any policy to be effective, they need to put people with lived experience in the core of what they do. So soon after being able to work with the 6 regional chapters and having the first Global Summit of Refugees, we actually followed up with the next, we followed up with regional summits. I remember very clearly that, you know, when we were having conversation with our colleagues and with stakeholders and UN agencies or the UNHCR around how could we take some of the dialogues from Geneva to the regions, at times where regionalization process right now wasn't a conversation back then. It was literally a few months later in October 2018, I think almost at the end of 2018, we were able to hold the first Asia Pacific Summit of Refugees, which was then followed up by MENA Summit of Refugees, the European and the African, and now we have the Latin and the North America in progress. So all of the findings and the key recommendations from all of these summits were basically put into a document called a manifesto. A manifesto, a trans-border manifesto, is basically the outcome document of regional refugee summits that GRN has put together and organized, which outlines the 5 overarching policy priorities of global refugee community. And that included participation, protection, pathways, decent work, integration and inclusion. And so this manifesto document was basically something that we actually tried to produce from the bottom-up approach. It was exactly during the years that we during the years to first Global Refugee Forum, we realized that the first Global Compacts on Refugees document was something that was produced from top to bottom. But we wanted to make sure that our regional summits, as well as our manifesto, looked at solutions and looked at issues that came from bottom-up approach. And our manifesto really talks out loud to that. And I think soon after, or as we were holding our regional summits, the GRN members were able to actually get much more heavily involved in the negotiation process of the Global Compacts, the Global Compact on Refugees document. We were able to impact and draft some of the language around refugee inclusion, whole of society approach, multi-stakeholder approach, and indicate how important it is that when we are actually implementing the GCR to include refugees. It was, and soon after that, we've had GRN members being able to represent themselves into a lot of international forums to not only amplify on the voices of people with lived experience, but also to come across with the document of manifesto. And our work basically meant that we have been given a greater responsibility, and we were able to work again with our regional chapters in towards the first Global Refugee Forum. We were able to advocate and ensure that the first Global Refugee Forum is going to have a high number of refugee representatives in each session, in each platform, in each panel. We clearly remember that in 2016, when the first summit in the New York Assembly happened, we only had one refugee representative in the actual panel. And for us, the voices of refugees and the refugee representation was clearly an absent space in 2016. But GRN, along with all the other refugee partners from the chapters, we were able to advocate very strongly that in the first Global Refugee Forum, each panel and each session would carry or would have a refugee expert, a refugee leader, and a refugee representative, ensuring that we were also maintaining a gender representative in those sessions. For some of us, or for myself in particular, I was able to attend the first Global Refugee Forum as a gender audit, and to be able not to only advocate for a refugee representative, but also to make sure that the voices of women and girls were included in those platforms. So soon after, or as we were preparing towards the first Global Refugee Forum, it was very important for us to ensure that refugee participation becomes a commitment to our governments, to our stakeholders, to our donors, and we do understand that meaningful refugee participation and requires an investment. And in order to do that, GRN put together the first pledge on refugee participation for the Global Refugee Forum. It's called Refugee Participation Pledge. And today, with so much of excitement, I can tell you that we've got 4 governments which have signed now the Refugee Participation Pledge, and those include Australia, Canada, Denmark, and Netherlands. And we are quite thrilled and excited that we've got these 4 governments on board, because that obviously means that we are able to create more opportunities and to open more opportunities to our refugee-led networks and to our refugee-led initiatives down on the ground who requires this kind of support. And for many of them, they don't have the privilege I have, or they don't have the privilege of resettled refugees to be able to travel, to be able to speak English. Right now, as I'm speaking, you know, we can't have access to our refugees in Cox's Bazar because the internet access is still not working, or it still hasn't reached there yet. So I still consider myself as a privileged refugee, being able to speak English, being able to make myself into Australia, even though I had a very difficult journey on its own, and it would take me, actually, I would be very interested to share my own personal story as well one day around how I came and what were the challenges on that. So soon after, we actually announced the first refugee participation pledge. Not only that the 4 governments were able to sign the pledge, but we also had other important international actors like IKEA Foundation, Open Society Foundation, which has been doing a tremendous amount of work in bringing refugee leadership into this space. They also signed our pledge, as well as many other NGOs. So, and that is, I think, our second achievement towards the Global Refugee Forum. And lastly, if not least, we were also able to put together a refugee participation guideline. And this guideline really talks about what can you do to ensure that participation happens in a meaningful way. What can you do before you actually put a refugee into a scene, or what can you do, or how do you actually see, or how do you improve the refugee response sector? And this refugee participation guideline was put in support of asylum access in California, and we really do thank Diana for the great work that she did with GRN in putting this guideline, as well as other scholar experts like James from Carleton University and a very influential leader from LEARN as well. So our work, obviously, we wanted to ensure that our refugee participation pledge is not going to be just a signatory piece of document, but it's going to have its action implemented on the ground, on the local level. And as we came back home from the first Global Refugee Forum, we wanted to make sure that we have more voices from people from the most underrepresented areas. But unfortunately, as you all know, we were hit with COVID-19 crisis, and COVID-19 itself has been a shock to many of us, but unfortunately it does hit refugees harder. For many refugees, you know, while we are all, I mean, for myself in particular, let's say I am in Australia and I hear about the restrictions that, or the kind of prevention that we need to take in order to stay safe from the COVID-19, like social distancing. But I really do worry when I hear those kind of protection measures, and question myself, what's happening to our colleagues in Cox's Bazar? What's happening to my colleagues in Thai-Burma border? What's happening to my colleagues, or especially to displaced people in Afghanistan? What's happening to undocumented refugees in Iran who are not necessarily receiving any kind of support either by UNHCR, or to what extent can UNHCR actually reach to undocumented refugees? I'm sure they're doing their best, but to what extent their resources allow them to do so? Or to what extent do we have refugees part of the National Health Response Plan? So very soon after, the Global Refugee-Led Network wanted to put together a conference where it would bring refugee leaders and refugee-led initiatives to talk about the unmet needs, the key issues around COVID-19. And I think it was just a few weeks ago where we were able to hold a conference bringing refugee-led initiatives together. And in that conference, a lot of refugee leaders were able to talk about the opportunities, as well as coordination and collaboration that we could do collectively within the refugee space to ensure that in this emergency situation, we are able to support and take resources to the communities in an effective way. We heard a lot from many refugees, you know, in that call, but also in many other forums, that as international actors are being forced to withdraw from operational fields, as travels are being restricted again and again, it's refugees as the first and the last responders to any kind of crisis, whether it's coronavirus or whether it's any other crisis, they are left on their own to control the situation again. And hence, we think that COVID-19 has been another clear testimony that we need to include refugees in our solution, because they have expertise, they are capable, and they are organized. They just need support. They need investment, just like every other actor that works. So very soon after the global conference, which I think we've had a representation of more than 170 refugees, and we were able to have clear discussion in terms of where the support should go in terms of COVID-19, where are the challenges, understanding the unusual ways of working as people are now all moving into a digital space, and we've been able to put a report together, and for those of you who are interested, we will be able to share that report with you all. Similarly, we've been also able to do a few other things through our #Refugees Rights campaign in the Asia Pacific region. We've been looking again GRN, how do we make sure that when we talk about refugee representation and refugee leadership, we do emphasize on the vulnerability or on the situation that women or refugee women has been put into. Through hashtag Refugees Rights Campaign in the Asia Pacific region, we've been able to look at refugee women nurses, refugee women doctors who are working on the front line and what they are doing to actually support the affected population. They've been producing podcasts in different languages. They've been able to hold online webinars with communities in the region, but also having live conversation through Facebook page in different languages every week to ensure that the communities are receiving life-saving materials, and we are able to fill in that gap of communication that we face in regards to COVID-19. Similarly, we've been looking at how can we raise some sort of support that could allow for some funding for refugee-led initiatives, and we've put together COVID-19 emergency appeal, and these are some of the work that GRN has been doing. So, in a summary, but I would conclude by saying that we have put together 3 important actions to follow up, and I would really like to call all of you to support GRN on those. One is that we asked very clearly in the Global Refugee Forum that we want to have a refugee EXCOM observer seat at the UNHCR Regional Bureau. We want to have a refugee EXCOM observer seat, but also a UNHCR Regional Bureau refugee advisors. Refugees currently do not have membership of UNHCR's governing body or governing membership body, the executive committee and the standing committee. So the GRN is really calling on the stakeholders to support the establishment of a refugee observer seat on the UNHCR's EXCOM, as well as advisory position in each of the UNHCR's regional bureaus. And lastly, I would really like to ask everybody on the call to look at ways that they could support and scale up the refugee-led best practices, but also ensuring that we do prioritize and we do put women and girls first when it comes to our refugee-led solutions, which requires your support. I'll end it there, and I do apologize, Andenis, for going over the time.
Najeeba, that was absolutely perfect. I think it's so important that we hear the full GRN story up front. And it's amazing and inspiring to hear that success of a transnational advocacy movement from the bottom up, getting signatures from states, from international organizations, from large foundations, but equally the challenges you face and the way ahead. I think now we're going to turn to perspectives from the other panelists, who bring different regional perspectives, different thematic perspectives. So I think, Shaza, you were going to go next.
Yeah, I don't know what I say because Najeeba always start and she left nothing for us to speak about. However, I would like to talk about the importance of the participation as already mentioned by Najeeba, and how we think about it and why we are fighting for being meaningful participation seat or role. So before of that, I will ask some question. This is the question that we ask for ourselves, like what kind of participation are we speaking about? And how can participation be more effective, and what kind of organized or structured process would be viable and successful? What kind of relationship would we like to establish with the stakeholders and other actors involved in decision making? And how do we transform refugee efforts and their organized process into something sustainable over time? To answer some of these questions, I will go to focus on 4 aspects: quality and types of participation, organizational structures, agency and collaboration, and sustainability. Like quality and types of participation, actually refugees most of the time are include in a survey as numbers, as candidates, and for example, or such completing and evaluating some stuff that just to tick tokenization, we can say, and they are rarely heard about the result of the survey and any proposals that they are consulted for. And this, we feel like that all lead to the false participation, and that what we need to do to have a meaningful role when we are involved in something. So it's not about being in the program as a number or as a person, but it's about having us in all process, like from the planning, conducting, evaluating, monitoring. Refugees should be in all these levels and stages. So we feel like also refugees are prepared to participate and advocate in all spaces. They can have also a real impact on decision making. So they are not only an inputs for projects, but they are agents with the capacity of planning, implementing, and evaluating policies concerning refugees and other forcibly displaced. As we said, nothing for us without us. This is what we have from the beginning, that refugee should be part of all the process that affecting their lives. So, however, this is not enough, because sometimes some organizations are asking refugees to be there and to sit on the decision-making tables and negotiation tables and spaces, but they have no power to do anything. They just come as a decor. And what we try to have is a power to influence decisions. Like in this regard, we are considered necessarily to create spaces for board participation of refugee and other forcibly displaced people, where they can actually prepare proposals and then present them, and also where be a member of the public policies to design, executed, and evaluated. Participation above all means that there is a voice and a vote in different instances of equal terms with other actors involved. And that's why we have our pledge about the meaningful participation, because we feel like this is the key for us, for refugees in general, to have impact on their lives. The other aspect, as I said, it's organizational structure. So we find that working in local, it's amazing, but also we need to have our structure as a global. So we have many different channels, like we have people in local level, national level, and also we have an influence and a seat on the negotiable tables on the global and regional level. So we will be, as Najeeba again mentioned, as a bridge. We take the information from global to the people in the root and in the ground, and then we try to help them to let their voices be heard on the global and regional level. So I think, again, the agency and collaboration. So the independence and autonomy of refugee-led organization and network in relation to other actors, it's really important. And we need to recognize that having a strategic alliance with the other actors and identifying potential alliance is in each one of them is really important. Generally, NGOs that have had experience and initiative of a company organizational process led by refugee and other forcibly displaced people were identified as a fundamental ally. So we need to be as a partner. This is why I ask if we can be a partner. It's better than be someone invited for to a conference and that's it. So we need to be a partner with whoever want to work on refugees and displaced people, because in this way we feel like we own this project and we can play a meaningful role. And this is a fundamental request and right. And lastly, the sustainability. This is one of our challenging and it's not for GRN only, it's for all the refugee-led organization. Sustainability is really important, and this is where all of us are facing challenges because of the economic and human resources. It's really difficult to maintain this and develop refugee-led organization and networks. And sustainability here, it's either a changing of experience and participation in qualified spaces and leadership training that can help for strengthen the refugees, or as I said, kind of financial sustainability. So we can have also the resources to conduct some consultation, to buy some stuff, or so on. So it's really important for us to have people behind us to support our role. And what we see now so far, that the funder always for refugee-led organization ask for a lot of logistics stuff, which is somehow it's really difficult for refugee-led initiatives to maintain, or to be registered, to have a bank account, and so many things make receiving funding sometimes so hard, and it's impossible. So this is also what we ask our partners and the other stakeholders to look at it and try to shift it and find a way, easier way to give some kind of gift granted for refugee-led organization to be able to achieve their policy or their objectives. I will insist again, the last point that I want to share. We in GRN are trying to deal with the whole society approach, and we are trying to not forget anyone, like from the gender, elderly, disabled, and minors. So we are trying to look at all people in the community, including the locals and host community. So whenever we have any activity, we try to include both sides, the refugee and the host community, because we believe that this is the way where we can achieve better and more. And this is obviously now we can see it in the situation of the COVID-19, like we are lockdown situation and no one can help. So each one and each small organization in the local area that are supporting each other, like host community or refugees. So again, I will insist on all stakeholders to try to think again about the situation and the relation and collaboration between refugee-led organization and them, and trying to facilitate better ways to improve our work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaza. Mustafa, over to you.
Thank you so much. So those are great points, and what I do just in the basically in the interest of time, I'll read my notes. So hopefully I don't take much time. And so if you see me just kind of look at reading, so please excuse me, then I'll be more than happy to answer all the questions or comments you might have after, as it is important to get questions from people and then for us to have a chance to answer them. So experiencing the perils of refugee status myself set my life on a trajectory that I would never have previously conceived. Tackling the countless uphill battles of establishing nonprofit organizations in Canada, or working with many other refugee-led organizations across the world to support refugees struggling and empowering them economically to become a contributors and agent of change. This remarkable journey has allowed me the chance to work closely with a variety of stakeholders that hold the refugee cause close to their hearts: activists, volunteers, businesses, policymakers, governments, and government officials. I'm always so impressed on how much knowledge and information they have about refugees, statistics, data, and stories. However, less impressive and disappointing even in few answers that there are when I ask the same stakeholders what they know about how refugees can contribute to the local communities, to the policymaking, to the economies they live in, and the benefits they can bring to states, especially amidst a declining population in North America and Europe. Nearly every discourse on refugees refers to issues through a humanitarian lens and aid receivers, or implementing partners at best. But what overlooked is the perception of refugees as a source of change and solutions. The Global Compact on Refugees make a critical new call for meaningful participation of refugees and affected population in high-level decision-making and planning of refugees programming. However, the pathway to implementation of this call to action remain a mystery. The most actors in the field, or even in some cases, remain unwanted conversation in terms of like how to implement the meaningful participation of refugees. So why meaningful participation is important? How in practice can that be done? This is the question where I hope people can think more about and maybe ask us more questions about it. At gathering like the Global Refugee Forum recently, the last one that happened, refugees are generally discussed as a recipients of humanitarian aid, not agents of control of their own lives. The huge scope for real progresses in these kind of forums and what they represent has to include the very people, and it's intended to help. And we have seen some advancement in the GRF, but that was kind of a little bit more exceptional, where we've seen about 70 refugees participating. But it's still in perspective, a lot of people maybe focus on a number as a 70, but a lot of people don't realize that actually those 70s conclude less than 2% of people who came to basically the GRF. If you think of a forum on women's rights or indigenous rights, and then you hear that there was a less than 2% participation from women and indigenous, then I think you would see the whole world is writing stories about this. On the other end, for refugees, that 2% was an advancement, was something that's unprecedented. In the last few years, more than ever, refugees in the world are becoming self-reliant and included in communities, taking education and economic opportunities, and setting up successful refugee-led organizations and promising networks. Yet, we refugees are often shut out of discussions about how to help us. In some way, our issues are way more important than we are. And the question today is whether governments, NGOs, and other nonprofits will simply continue trying to assist refugees, or whether they will be bold enough to empower them further. In terms of as a conclusion for a smarter future, what many people also hopefully don't know, that refugee and local-led organizations across the world receive less than 2% of funding allocated to humanitarian causes. Yet with that, and still kind of insufficiencies and spending continue to be a big problem globally. We've seen this in terms of the UNHCR struggling to simply get the full budget they're trying to work on, but at the same time, there's a lot of, there's $1 billion basically being spent on refugees in different places, but still refugees are fleeing those $1 billion. However, with even just a tiny funding trickle, refugee-led initiatives and local actors have already made their voices heard and proved their strength and effectiveness in serving their own community. Empowering those leaders is not just the humanitarian thing to do, is the smart thing to do, is the thing that will ensure better return on a humanitarian investments. Thank you.
Thanks, Mustafa. Last but not least, Anila.
Thank you, Alex. Though I'm just thinking what to say, because my old friends who are in the panel, they have covered so much. But I think the main component which I really like to discuss, and because I'm living in European region and leading European Coalition, which is regional chapter of Global Refugee-Led Network, I will discuss about the narrative, how been refugee been presenting still in the forced migration debate, and especially its link with the policy and being living a person who is holding refugee status in Europe. When I arrived in Europe, I was considered as a burden. It was not because I was not educated. It was not I do not know how to speak English. It was not knew how to be a good representative. But it's all about because of narrative how policy describe our refugee. Still, if we are saying we are refugee, we think about a person who does not know how to function, who has so much ask, who is totally vulnerable. So this thing, what we are trying to do on Global Refugee-Led Network. We are really trying to unpack, to change this narrative about refugee, who we are really literally giving them name, a face, a powerful face, who can present, who can talk, and talk very loudly. You just saw Najeeba, you just heard Mustafa, you just listen how beautifully Shaza described our struggle. That's what we are trying to do. We are sharing our knowledge as a very valuable insight, and we are having this argument in the policy by face to face. Because if you go and see global compact of refugee, they are saying about meaningful participation of refugee, and they're saying they really want to define refugee as a recognized response are most effective when they're actively and meaningfully engaged. Those all are intent to protect and assist. So we are here in a Global Refugee-Led Network at GRN. We are trying to convince and to show what we mean by meaningfully and what even we mean refugee-led. Because in Europe, I will share my today's experience. We are organizing after our global summit, which we hold on 8th of April. We are on European Coalition with my colleague Shaza. We both are living in Europe. We are organizing our European region on 15th of May. And yesterday, I sent an email to one person whom I know from a few years in European Commission. And I said, let's Shaza try. We just send an email. Let's see if they want to come. And they said, yes, why not? We will come. So, this is the change. Being a refugee, maybe they accept our invitation to be part of our discussion, because we are changing all the discourse, and we are giving their confidence that is important, and we are showing why it is important if we involve the stakeholder, the recipient, the beneficiary directly with a meaningful way. All the impact, all the struggle will change. That's what we are doing. And as Mustafa said, I will say, I'm from South Asian region, and when I was born, raised, struggling, having my own self as myself, Anila, in Pakistan, I always struggle who I am. And now again, I'm struggling here who I am, not because of I'm female, but because I'm not even having my own identity. So many identity crises which we are facing. So that's what we are trying to do. We are showing, we are learning, and we are bringing our own knowledges together to change this discourse and to saying, this is the time, this COVID-19 giving us all opportunity to think what is a new normal and what will be a new normal, and this is our chance. And I'm looking forward for our debate, and if you have any question, you can contact us. And so many covered by Najeeba, Shaza, and Mustafa, so I just share my own thoughts. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you, all four of you, for those very inspiring and detailed perspectives. There are a series of things that really strike me. I mean, all of you have really emphasized the need for meaningful participation, and not just participation, but meaningful representation. Anila, you talked about needing a name, a face, and a voice. Shaza, you talked about nothing about us without us. And I was so struck by Mustafa, you highlighting that even at the Global Refugee Forum, really represented by many people as a success in terms of refugee participation, it was less than 2% participation by refugees. And you also highlighted that less than 2% of humanitarian funding is going through refugee-led organizations. And so clearly, from everything that Najeeba described, there have been major breakthroughs, but there's still a long way to go to achieve that really representative, inclusive participation. We really want this to be a dialogue, so we're going to open up to the audience. In the interest of sort of time and technological coordination, we'd encourage audience members to enter questions in the chat box. We'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. We have colleagues in the background curating and collating some of those questions, and Anthony and I will try to introduce some of them. Whoever wishes to speak to those questions, feel free from the panel. We have a lot of questions already, and some of them are quite interesting. The one I want to start with from the audience is from Dr. Stella Mascarenhas Keys. And she says, to all the panelists, what role do you think academics can play? For instance, can they provide you with an evidence base on which you can base your advocacy for national and international policies and practices? If so, what do you think might be the mechanisms for doing this? And you'll understand my sort of own bias in asking this question. There are many academics on this call, not only from the Refugee Studies Centre, but from around the world. And equally, as an academic, I'm conscious that we need to change how we work to make it participatory, to make it inclusive, to involve refugee researchers in more meaningful ways. So I suppose the first question to put to you is, what role do you see for academics? And whoever would like to go first, feel free.
I can go first, really, a little bit. I mean, being on the advisory committee for LEARN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, has taught me a lot. And I think one of the reasons it's not easy for me, to be honest, it's just kind of to join any academic body in a way that doing research on refugees. It has always been the research on refugees. I mean, historically, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's always been on how best practices, for example, aid being delivered to refugees. Research on activities and programmings, whether from UNHCR or from other NGOs or INGOs and all of that, on the communities around refugees and all of that. Yet we're not seeing a research in terms of what is the collective impact of those refugees in the community. I'm not saying there is zero research. Definitely there are some, but even for me, if I wanted to write an article or if I want to speak on something, like going through and trying to research those kind of research, I always struggled to find them. I always struggled to find what was, like, for example, if refugees in camp, what was the outcomes that came out of this? How did they contribute? Were they consulted on the research that being done from day one in that sense? Also, most often when they get some research questions or collaboration requests, it always comes in a way that the research topic has already been decided. Like kind of the topic, the narrative of it and all of that's already been decided. So now my role is that to deliver and then feed those kind of information rather than just me to actually participate in the beginning. And then so often when I get those kind of requests, I was like, what if you change this? And what if you change this? Like, oh, that's a good idea, but we can't do it anymore. We already submitted the proposal. So definitely engaging refugees from day one in establishing and then creating those kind of research topics. This is one thing. The second is that definitely to create more research around the refugee contributions and role in terms of as a refugee leaders or refugee-led organizations, or even refugee-led group or initiatives across the globe.
Fantastic. Would anyone else from the panel like to comment?
Maybe if I can add just a quick comment, Alex. I think one thing that is very clear, so if you go across the globe, we will come across one thing which is quite in common amongst us refugees, and that is the lack of data and documentation around the work that we do at local, national, and regional level. I think it is very, very important to build on the data around the kind of work that refugees or refugee-led initiatives are actually doing. I think for many refugees, especially if I am to talk on the Asia-Pacific region, we have fantastic people that are doing amazing things, but because of the lack of funding, they don't necessarily have the time to actually put the research around the work that they do or to bring the evidence to what they have been actually doing to show the impact. I think having scholars and research academics to actually prioritize within their research, to talk about or to actually do documentation and build on the data around refugee-led practices. It's so important. I think it was towards the Global Refugee Forum where we were all asked to identify promising or good practices. I always wonder, what happens to those good practices that we try to actually bring up to that forum? To what extent were we able to draw attention to our scholars and researchers, not only to look at what is actually the definition of a good practice? And we had a lot of question and a lot of challenge around that itself. You know, a promising practice could have been something with millions of dollars investment into a project and being able to show a lot of impact, but refugee-led initiatives going through a lot of challenges, not being able to register, not being able to have a bank account, not being able to receive any funding, but then still doing inspiring and impactful things on the ground, which is not necessarily documented, and there's lack of data in there. I think the second thing that I would really ask the scholars and researchers to support GRN in particular is to help us to build the indicators for refugee participation pledge. That's also something that we look for support. And the last thing that I really want to get the support of the researchers and the scholars is that we have been able to put maybe little, if not a lot, around why meaningful refugee participation needs to happen. I think it's about time for us to use the support of scholars to build the evidence as to how we could implement refugee participation. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. There's another very interesting question that's come from Elena Mora, which I think speaks to some of the themes that were introduced by Anila. And Elena asks, perhaps looking at the language itself is a good start. The term refugee has allowed a group to have rights, but it's also often carried particular stereotypes. And so she wonders whether there's a need to think about changing the language to consider language like refugee citizens or some different language to connote different types of visibility, different types of voice and accountability. So I think that's a really interesting question. I'd be interested to hear how you feel about the language that's often used, particularly around terms like refugee. Is that of value to you? Is it something that carries stereotypes and connotations? How can the language be rethought to change some of the narratives?
Yeah, sure. I would like to answer this question because I'm living in Netherlands, and in the Netherlands they are using newcomers because they really think the similar feeling like refugee is not good. So they really give a welcome feeling to refugees. So they're using newcomers. So, but as we are talking about different people who are living in different regions, so maybe sometime we need to not to give a tokenization feeling, but we really need to give a feeling of we are talking about refugees who are really in camps, who are even in an asylum procedure. Even so many systems do not recognize them as a refugee because of their statelessness, because of undocumented. So generally we are talking about people on the move. It's so complicated, the term of refugees. And I think since the Geneva Convention of 1956, if I'm not wrong, this debate is not being generated. And I think as the earlier question, we said where research can help us and we could find a new terms which shouldn't be a stigma, and how we can come up with this should be like a identity or a legal right. Okay, I'm getting married, I'm married. I'm getting divorced, I'm divorced. It should be like that. It should be normalized. But still, due to some reasons, we are more worried about the security of the borders in the system. We are worried about the other things, but we are not talking about still refugee protection. So that's why we are keeping the name of refugee as an alarming situation. So it's not easy, but I totally agree. In some region, we use refugee as as I just said, as a newcomer, but it's not that much easy. So this one thing we are trying to do, and even because I was also part of a Global Refugee Forum, and I witnessed everyone talking about refugee, but as like, let's do something. And the investment they put, it was huge, but out result and how we can come, all the pledges were made with after that much investment What is a long-term result? We don't know. That's what we are trying to see. Is that refugee terms, are we just using to make our businesses or what? So this is quite complicated. It's not easy to answer.
Can I give a quick note on this? It's something maybe I'll give a note because from a real personal experience. When I came to Canada, I used to hide that I'm a refugee. I wouldn't say it to anyone. I don't want to say it. And I felt every time I talk and to others in a way, because refugees, basically the stigma or the stereotype is that either uneducated, unprofessional, and to some extent dangerous in that sense. But I think working more with refugees and getting a little bit into it, I read a book written by one of my friends, Senator Ratna Midvar and Dana Wagner, called Flight and Freedom, 30 Stories of Refugees. Reading those stories, and then for the first time at one point, and definitely working with a lot of refugees on the ground and learning of, so I start looking on the positive side about refugees, also resilience, adaptable, their life survival, life victims of life survival at the same time. They were able to say, I understand to those who go through hardship. So I started to say, you know what, like maybe it's ironic. Nobody should feel lucky to be a refugee, but then there's something happened in my mind at that point. You know what, I'm lucky. Like today, the way I am today is just because the experience that I lived in or what I've been through. So that also gave me a lot of empowerment. So maybe changing narrative on refugees also, I acknowledge that starts within us as a refugees, and then within the others, just kind of to put and then to show the other sides of being refugees, how strong you become, with your contributions and all of that. It's funny to the point, I think my biggest win at one point, that was the funny situation that happened with me. When I was talking about this and I changed my narrative, and I was talking to one of my friends who's an immigrant, not a refugee. And then after I talked to him, he stayed for about like half an hour trying to convince me that technically he's a refugee. He felt jealous, like just kind of the changing narrative. And that's the first time ever I've seen someone that wanted to convince someone that, you know, I'm technically a refugee. So maybe aside from trying to figure out a new term, is actually changing narrative and look at the refugees from the other side.
There's a lot of interest in the work coming through on the chat function, and some questions about some clarification about the GRN that, I mean, maybe Najeeba or any of you would like to answer. So Shamima asks whether you're active in Bangladesh around Cox's Bazar. Rana is asking whether you're working and active in Turkey. Sithari has asked for a little bit more detail and background on the initial development of the Network for Refugee Voices, the NRV that Najeeba mentioned before the formation of the GRN. And Leon is asking how people can access the Refugee Participation Pledge. So I think those are just sort of areas where there's a request for sort of more information. Perhaps Najeeba or one of you could give a sense of, are you working in Bangladesh? Are you working in Turkey? What was the NRV backstory, and how can people find out more? So there's a real interest and I think excitement in the work coming through.
Maybe if Shaza wants to add any comment, and then I'll just add to it. Shaza, do you want to actually answer that question, and then I'll add?
Yeah, I will start with the NRV because I am a member of NRV when we work together and plan for the Global Summit. NRV is still there and they are still working, but some member of NRV are turned to have a more global role and became a global refugee-led network. And we still working together, and because we are, as a global refugee-led network, we are working with all initiatives like refugee-led initiatives, and we are there. And for the Turkey, we have our summit last September, and we are working in all MENA because, as we said, we have 6 regions, and in each region we are conduct counseling in this, the region summit. And last September, we have the MENA summit, and we work with a lot of NGOs and refugees-led initiatives in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. Most of them are Syrians. And yeah, we do work, and we do present in Turkey and MENA region. For Bangladesh, I will leave it for Najeeba.
Thank you, Shaza. So just quickly, the first comment that I want to make to all the audience is that as GRN, as Global Refugee-Led Network, I want to be clear that we are not saying we are representative of all refugees in the world, because that is impossible. We will do our best to bring a representation to refugees' voices where it's possible. I think I've learned so much by working on a global spectrum from different regions, and understanding that each region has its own complexity, and not necessarily one size or one solution will fit all. So for me to go back to the Asia Pacific region, we are facing with so many different challenges compared to MENA, or compared to Europe, or compared to North America or Latin America. Our needs and our challenges are different. Our stories are the same, but the solution could also be the same. For us, in terms of having access to our refugee-led initiatives in the Asia-Pacific region, we did realize that many refugees in our region are not necessarily having the legal status to movement. They're not necessarily able to go and to travel or to present, or because of a lot of security reasons, not necessarily are able to come in a public forum and to share their stories and their concerns, because they're still trying to face, they're still facing risks and insecurity, and are still in the process of claiming protection. And I think the other aspect that I really want to share is that in the Asia Pacific regions, there is a lot of barriers to participation itself when I am to compare it with some other regions, for example, in Europe. When I was in Europe, I realized that there were so many refugee-led initiatives already being formed on local and national level. There were already a bit of understanding around NGOs working with refugee-led initiatives. However, in the Asia Pacific region, and I also came across that there were other refugee-led initiatives. It was exactly in 2015 when myself and Shaza and the other two refugees that hold the first side event on refugee self-representation and call out on the idea of Global Refugee-Led Network. Soon after that, we heard about NRV, the Network of Refugee Voices, which was established. And for us, that was a very good news, understanding that it has motivated people in the European region in particular to actually put that together. And for us, it was a success. And NRV is now part of GRN as well, as you heard from Shaza. But one thing that I want to go back is that when I compare the Asia region to other regions, we realized that, the barriers I could say could be very much more different, and I'll give you the context of Bangladesh. It was exactly in September, if I'm not wrong, 2019, when we actually put together APNOR, the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, which is the Asia regional chapter for GRN. We put together the forum as a way of having discussion around what are our key priorities for the first Global Refugee Forum, and what are the key messages that we need to take with us to the Global Refugee Forum. And unlike other regions, most of our conversations so far is not able to happen through face-to-face. We are only able to bring a number of refugees together into a face-to-face forums. And we've been doing digital participation for so long now. From the first Asia Pacific Summit of Refugees to the second APNO Forum, we've been actually trying to contact and bring refugees onto an online platform. And to be honest, for some of you that might experience this just now as a result of COVID-19, for us, we actually used this process long ago just to ensure that we are able to have access to the most underrepresented refugees, and that includes refugees in the camps and Cox's Bazar. So just to give you an example, yes, we are in contact with refugees in Bangladesh. However, the challenges are so high. You do know that we didn't have internet access in Cox's Bazar till now. We have just been receiving news from UNHCR that internet access is now opening to Cox's Bazar, and we are in the progress of putting a forum specifically in the Asia for the Rohingya refugees, using the opportunity of the internet access. During the APNO forum back in September 2019, as a preparation to the first Global Refugee Forum, we had a group of Rohingya refugees to be ready to connect to our forum in September 2019. But unfortunately, the upheaval shift of the government in Cox's Bazar basically forced the NGO who was working with us to take away their space, to basically not allow for the internet access to go to the refugees, because they were scrutinized that any kind of engagement would become a kind of propaganda or protest against the government. So again, we were not able to actually include them into the forum, but we had to go into individual conversation. Right now, in the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, within our steering committee members, we actually have refugees from Bangladesh who are representing the Rohingya. I hope that answers. And I think in terms of the pledge, which is a very important point, I really do request those that are interested could either email myself or those in the Shaza or Anila, as well as Alex, to receive our detail. We are happy to share the pledge document. And if you're happy to be a signatory, we can have further conversation offline. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. We are running out of time, but there are a couple more questions that I want to try and squeeze in if we can. There are three questions that all relate to a common theme, which is how can we collectively empower refugees as researchers to be more represented in academia? So Hannah asks, how can we help empower young refugees to become representative in academia and in refugee discussion without negatively impacting on them? Relatedly, we've received a comment from Nadine saying, COVID-19 is affecting the academic sessions for refugee students. How is this going to affect them? And very interestingly, Jeff Crisp highlights that in the mid-1990s, UNHCR's own mission statement said that UNHCR is committed to the principle of participation by consulting refugees on decisions that affect their lives, and asks, how about an independent and refugee-led evaluation of the extent to which this principle has been operationalized? So I wanted to squeeze in that sort of those three questions under one by saying, how can we really empower refugees to be more represented in academia, and particularly younger refugees to have that voice and nurture them? So any quick reflections on that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important, as we are saying, and we experience and our engagement in debate, we think it's really important. All the refugees, asylum seekers, stateless people on the move, they really need to learn how to share their story. When they are sharing their story, their knowledge as a valuable knowledge is really important, because in the end, they need to understand, by the help of academia, like how we are generating knowledge and how we can be careful not to make the same mistake again and again. And if refugees who are there and writing, they hold their pen and they power the story by themselves, I think it will be give them more visibility, and we can have this training for them. And I think as I always feel more confident because I was giving confidence from my professor. As Mustafa said, I also hired this fact for almost like more than 3 years that I'm a refugee. But my professor, Helen Hutchinson, I study in international social studies in Hague, and she gave me this confidence. Anila, you are not refugee, you are a refugee researcher. So you need to tell your story with confidence, and you have your knowledge as your power. So your knowledge is your power, and you have to make it valid through your writing. So I think this is really important. We need to do that. But the thing is that training, they need more sponsorship, trainings, and also skills. How they know what they are going to do. But this kind of platform can give them tools. Like I just tell you, like COVID-19 forced us, all of us, to become in this digital world. And so many people do not know how to enter this digital world. So how we can be carefully give them this tool, like this digital skills becoming like a tool of if I'm not here, if I'm not using my laptop, if I don't have web camp, the tools are making me, included or excluded. So how we can be make more conscious decision, and how can we make more collaboration and network to enter a refugee researcher in this debate, and they have the skills and the training.
If I can just quickly add something, I think it's a very good question. I think higher education itself is an important dream for every refugee that we speak to. I think at the moment, one thing that I can speak very loud is that we have very restricted access to universities at the moment. We really need to work together in easing some of those access to the universities globally. And also other higher education institutions. There are very limited opportunities of research, especially for refugees themselves, who are not necessarily able to tick every criteria box that universities do require. I think we also require agenda prescribed social-cultural norms as well. That's also another important part that we need to consider. And I think the other most important point is the financial constraints that often prevent the meaningful participation of people from refugee background. I think these are some of the key points that I would really recommend to consider when we talk about empowerment of refugees, especially in higher education or as researchers and scholars. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing regarding to the consultation and having a consultation with the refugees independently or something. It's again, I think it's much better outcome if the refugee conduct the consultation among themselves comparing to NGOs or INGOs, because they will be more flexible to speak freely, and the refugee can understand the language or many other aspects. But what we need again here is the resources and training, resources financially, or even partnership as working together. Like we can also plan the research or the consultation together, and we conduct it together. So it's again possible, but when we have the willingness. I think everything will start with willingness. If we are willing to give refugees this role, we can do it.
Thank you all for your comments on that question. And I just want to share that we're going to actually attempt to add another seminar onto this series that addresses these issues around knowledge production within the sort of refugee, forced displaced community. I think there's a lot of conversation that can be had there, and it's something that we didn't get around to in putting this seminar series together in such a short amount of time. So I want to thank you all for your comments and participation throughout what has been a really riveting panel. We're all lucky to have the four of you coming back at the end of, not at the end of this, but for all the subsequent sessions, as I mentioned earlier. You each will be co-moderators with someone from Oxford as we continue the next 5 sessions. One question that I wanted to close out on for those that are in attendance today is asking from you representing the GRN, how can refugees participate in GRN and become involved in the work that you're all doing right now? Anyone, please?
Yes, as I said, and Najeeba and Shaza share, we are a network of networks, and we are based in each region. And the person who is interested to be linked with the GRN, they can reach out to our regional chapter representative, and they can easily be part, because we're really here to give them strength to add on in their advocacy and to bring their knowledges to a global level where we have this debate. So it's really easy to stay, because as Shaza said, we conducted and we are planning to have webinars. And last year, because COVID-19 didn't happen, so we were physically doing the consultation, but because of COVID-19, now we are organizing these online conferences where we are bringing all the regional chapters, refugee-led and migrant-led, migrant-led because I'm in Europe, so it's complicated. So refugee-led more into the network, so they can easily link with our regional representative, and we can easily link there. Yeah, that's no problem.
maybe if I can just add quickly, throughout the next series of webinars, we will have other representatives from the other regions. So that's another way of getting introduced to our regional chapters and to the focal points. But we can also send a list of the regional focal points to Alex and Angenis to share with you all. I think one thing that we also need to say as GRN is that I think those of you who are working with refugees also have access to refugees that we might not have. So I think it's a collaboration effort. Is we try to get the voice out there to refugees that we work with. But again, as I said in my earlier conversation, we are not able to represent everybody, and we might not be able to reach everybody. But then for those NGOs and INGOs that have greater capacity and greater resources and are reaching refugees far wider where we can't, please do let them know of our existence. We would really like to hear more from refugees on how we can work much more collaboratively and collectively. And that's something GRN is working now. We still don't claim to be a perfect network. It's a learning process for many of us to work on the global spectrum and to strengthen the regional chapters to support and strengthen the capacity of national led organizations. So we do count on your support as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And just to close out this commentary session, there are a couple of logistical questions as well that we're going to try to address at the RSC regarding contact with the panelists, transcript of the chat, and whether or not these things will be available, and indeed trying to pass on some of the resources that you all at the GRN have suggested individuals who are interested might want to have access to. So we're going to try to resolve those issues or those requests. For folks who are still in the chat, you're welcome to continue to write introductions or share your information as well. And once all of that is closed out, then we will close down the chat and we'll be able to download that transcript. So take the next 5, 10, 15 minutes if you'd like to add any additional comments before we circulate that at the end. So on my side of things, I really appreciate you taking the time to start kick off this seminar series. It was a really wonderful introduction. Any closing comments from all of you and from Alex, please? Thanks.
I just want to say a big thanks to Oxford and Refugee Studies. As I said in my introduction, it's been a long journey for us, but I'm really feeling reward. This kind of debate we are putting together, designing together. So thank you so much. And we need to give our knowledges more linkages and bridge to each other's work. This is really important. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward for this series to co-moderate with Oxford. Thank you.
And I just want to say a final thank you to all 4 of our panelists. This has been a really inspiring start. I think from the chat, you've seen how engaged people are, how much more information people want. We've had the group in the Zoom conversation. We've also been broadcasting live on YouTube. I hope that there'll be much more interest, much more engagement, and that that we'll be able to connect people after this to engage with the work of the GRN. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to my colleagues, not only Anila, but also everyone in the background who's been supporting with this technological adventure to put on this event. And please do join us at the same time next week, Wednesday, BST 5 p.m, when we'll be exploring in-depth perspectives from urban refugee-led organizations. So thank you very much, stay well, and we really appreciate you joining us.